Welcome back to Understanding Human Evil. This is session 5, and today we're going to look at the second part of our conversation about the banality of evil. As you probably realize by now, we're dividing the story of evil into different chunks or different types, we might call it. We have looked at, so far, we've looked first of all at the reality of evil. And then we went on from there to look at the notion that there's collective evil, evil carried out by groups, individual evil. We've looked at theories of evil, particularly looked at the distinction between a privation understanding of evil and a dualist understanding of evil. And then we have moved into one form of evil, which is radical evil, and we've given two different descriptions of what that might mean depending on which philosopher we're examining. Our focus was mainly on Immanuel Kant and the idea that evil is rooted, the word radical refers to rootedness in the person. We also found that there's certain elements of the Kantian thinking that leaves it too broad, and his concept of evil, the dynamic of evil being the subordination of the moral law for one's own personal interests or self-regard. However, the problem with Kant's view is that he doesn't really look at the consequences, and we've taken a very consequential view. So I would be adding into that piece, the Kantian piece, that his understanding of evil as being elevating one's personal regard over the moral law, the bit that's missing there that he needs to add with the consequence that grave suffering and harm is caused as a result. So that's where we've gotten to up to the next piece, which is the banality of evil. Now, here's the piece that makes the issue of the banality of evil more interesting from the point of view of Kant, which is that when we're looking at banal evildoing, we're actually no longer framing it in terms of the moral struggle within the person. So this was the innovation of Hannah Arendt's understanding of banal evildoing, which is that it's evildoing that has not caused the individual much moral conflict, because the evil is a consequence, but it's not intentional. It's not, the person hasn't volitionally decided they're going to do something evil. Rather, they're involved in a system, and their contribution to that system is producing grave evil. And this was grounded in her work on Eichmann and her analysis of the Eichmann trial. Now, Hannah Arendt already had understood this concept from her work on totalitarianism before she went to the trial in Jerusalem. But what she witnessed in Jerusalem in Eichmann's trial confirmed something that she already believed strongly, particularly in relation to her understanding of how citizens operate under totalitarianism, and that is that many of them collaborate and cooperate with evil without having even thinking about it. And as a result, she says that most evil in the world is carried out by people who never decided whether to be good or bad. So this is both revolutionary and also incredibly relevant and appropriate to much of what we're actually seeing in the world today. So in our last session, we examined one of the strong strands of banal evildoing, and that is thoughtlessness, unreflective behavior, a lack of the kind of self-reflection that Socrates, she uses Socrates as a model of the inner voice, the two-in-one conversation within the person about the moral importance of what they're doing. So that connects us back to Kant again. Today we're going to take two other strands of the banality of evil as it relates to evildoing and the individual. And these two strands are the role of obedience and the role of what I call role immersion. Hannah Arendt sees these as important aspects to understand why people collaborate with evildoing, and how a society, a group, a gang, a collective can descend into mass evildoing. And I think we're looking at the world today, we could say this is probably a very good time to be having this conversation. So the role of obedience. Hannah Arendt saw obedience as critical in understanding how the Holocaust and the Holodomor and other mass evils occur. Human beings obey. Now, Arendt believes that one of the greatest mistakes that we can make as mature adults is to believe that obedience is a virtue in and of itself, and that she understands that most societies function on the basis of obedience, which of course they do. And most societies would not function very well without obedience. So, for example, let's take a very simple example, which is that I'm driving into work and I stop at a red light. Why am I doing that? I'm doing that. I'm obeying the law which says you should stop at a red light unless you've got some very, very, very significant and good reason not to do so. And the reason our traffic system works is because people do stop at red lights and they do drive at green lights. They're obeying the law, they're obeying the rule. So in that simple example, we can see that laws and obeying laws is important for the functioning of any society. But for Arendt, she brings that a step further and she says, right, but why are you obeying this? And the reason I obey that law, and the reason that most people obey that law, they may not have even thought about it, is that they're consenting to that system. And they believe to some extent that this is the reason why our traffic works better, is that everybody's doing it. So we're obeying something that we consent to. And so for Arendt, the key piece of understanding obedience is consent. And it's consenting and accepting that the authority system you're in is a valid authority system. When that authority system moves towards evil doing, the question arises then, do you continue to give it your consent? And this is where she believes that the notion of obedience is never a justification for evil doing, because she doesn't say, why did you obey? She says, why did you consent? So in her understanding of that, she says, an adult consents where a child obeys. So here's she thinks that obedience is a childlike form of behavior. An adult consents where a child obeys. If an adult is said to obey, he actually supports the organization or the authority or the law that claims obedience. So now we're moved into the piece of personal responsibility. And this is the Nuremberg defense, which was, I was only obeying orders. For Hannah Arendt, that's not acceptable. And after Nuremberg, it was never an acceptable justification for evil doing, and that is as it is today. So when you commit a war crime, because your commanding officer ordered you to murder a civilian, and you do it, you are morally responsible and legally now responsible for a crime. So when Arendt was looking at this issue of obedience, she saw it at all kinds of levels. She did not accept Goldhagen's understanding of the Holocaust, that it was carried out by millions of Germans who were violently or virulently anti-Semitic, and that was the reason they did it. No, she believes it's much more banal than that. She believes that actually people got so used to just obeying the law that when the law became immoral, they continued to obey it without reflecting on the meaning of it. Now here we are again, going back to the thoughtlessness, because these strands in the cable are all connected together. There's thoughtlessness and then there's obedience. And so you're obeying a system which has turned toward evil doing, but you're not reflecting on that turn. And as a result of that, she concludes, she said about the Holocaust, she said, Himmler's overall organization relies not on fanatics, not congenital murderers, nor on sadists. It relies entirely upon the normality of job holders and family men. So how does this work? Because once you harness people who are unthinking, non-reflective, and now obedient, because obeying the law is important, you have a toxic condition for the spread of evil. And this is very different from the Kantian understanding of radical evil, because from Arendt's point of view, she's saying, no, this form of evil is more like a fungus. It does not have any roots. It spreads, but it's not rooted, because a fungus doesn't have any roots. It's on the surface. So evil is spreading throughout society through the normal job holders who are just obeying the law as they've been asked to do so. So this issue of consent then, she says, the authoritarian relation between the one who commands and the one who obeys rests neither on common reason nor on the power of the one who commands. Now, this is important because it's saying this isn't about the power of the one who commands, because that's a form of coercion. She makes that distinction between obedience and coercion. People sometimes obey because they're terrified, because they're afraid. She sees that as not real personal responsible obedience, because at that point the person is terrified. She makes some room for that as an understandable justification. So the one who obeys rests neither on common reason nor on the power of the one who commands. What they have in common is the hierarchy itself, whose rightness and legitimacy both recognize and where both have their predetermined stable place. So it is the acceptance of the legitimacy of the system. Once you do that, then obedience is a completely rational response to it. And that's how the German society was able to engage in the Holocaust. And it's why mass evildoing can occur in a society where everybody gives consent or belief that the system is okay. They might not understand it. They may say, well, I'm a bit puzzled, but there's a trust. There's a consent in the legitimacy of the hierarchy. Zygmunt Bauman also talks about this when he talks about, the idea that if a person has already cannot see that the outcome down the road when they're obeying the particular rule, that leaves them in a situation where they don't have to take responsibility for the outcome. So as a result of this, Arendt says that when you are then challenged with how you behaved and what you did, she says the question addressed to those who participated and obeyed orders should never be, why did you obey? But why did you support? This change of words is no semantic irrelevance for those who know the strange and powerful influence mere words have over the minds of men. Much would be gained if we could eliminate the pernicious word obedience from our vocabulary of moral and political thought. So I think that's a key insight. We cannot use the word obedience as any form of justification for evildoing. What we must do is we must look at it from the point of view of consent. Why did you consent and why did you support a regime that was actively engaging in murder and in creating grave evil? So the question then, why do people obey? What's the story? Was it because of the fear, the system, all that was going on there? Well, certain experiments show us that obedience is a very, very powerful part of the human condition. And as a result of that, we need to understand that it's not always in relation to simply that we can understand evildoing. We look at society and we look at people and we say obedience is part and parcel of our lives. The most famous of these examples is that of the Milgram experiment, which is frightening in its outcome. And I think that sometimes we don't want to think about it like this. We want to have a little bit more trust, maybe, or more optimism about the human being's ability to withstand pressure, to stand on their own 2 feet and make moral decisions grounded in moral thinking rather than obedience. But Milgram actually shows us that that is not the case for the majority of people. He gave an example of the experiment, and I'll just read that briefly. He said, I set up a simple experiment at Yale University to test how much pain an ordinary citizen would inflict on another person simply because he was ordered to do so by an experimental scientist. Stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives against hurting others. And with the subject's ears ringing with the screams of the victims, authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study, and the fact that most urgently demanding explanation. Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terribly destructive process. Moreover, even when the destructive effects of their work became patently clear, and they are asked to carry out actions incompatible with fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority. Now, that's an absolutely damning description of how morally weak people are when it comes to authority. You'll be familiar with the experiment because he got people to pretend that they were subjects of a learning experiment, and then the people who volunteered were asked to shock them using a dial if they got the answer wrong. So the experimenter sat there and gave a question. The person who was supposed to be learning, the learner who was an actor and who wasn't getting any shocks at all, in reality, but the people doing the experiment who had volunteered didn't know this. They thought they were. So the person in authority basically instructed the person doing the experiment to shock when they got something wrong, to shock the learner, and these shocks were delivered. And even though the actor was pretending to be shocked, the person continued to do so. So what's interesting is that before the experiment, Milgram held discussions with colleagues. And he said the general consensus, and he'd asked psychiatrists and other colleagues about what did they think the people who would be volunteering for this experiment, what level of shocks would they deliver, how would they do. And the consensus from these discussions was that only between 2 and 4% would be willing to inflict very severe shocks on the learner. The actual result was that all participants were willing to inflict severe pain up to 300 volts, and 65% were willing to inflict lethal levels of 450 volts. The results of the Milgram study thus completely undermined our optimistic beliefs concerning people's willingness to disobey orders to cause pain. Milgram himself made reference to the clear support his research provides for Arendt's thesis concerning obedience, and he writes, "After witnessing hundreds of ordinary people submit to the authority in our own experiments, I must conclude that Arendt's conception of the banality of evil comes closer to the truth than one might dare imagine. The ordinary person who shocked the victim did so out of a sense of obligation, a conception of his duties as a subject, and not from any particularly aggressive tendencies." So you see that the person wasn't operating out of anything, wasn't rooted in themselves. They had no hatred for the learner that they were shocking. They had no personal involvement with them. They didn't even know who they were. And most of these people, they were very, very upset afterwards, a lot of these people, but they still did it because they were told to do it by somebody in authority. And this takes us back to Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist, who says, "Moral people can be driven into committing immoral acts even if they know or believe that the acts are immoral, providing that they are convinced that the experts, people who by definition know something they themselves don't know, have defined their action as necessary. After all, most actions in our society are not legitimated by the discussion of their objectives, but by advice or instruction offered by people in the know." So Bauman is agreeing here with Arendt insofar as he's saying, most people will do immoral things and hurt other people if they're put in a situation where they are instructed to do so by somebody in authority. But the more important piece for Arendt is, it's not the fact that the person is in authority, it's that the person who is obeying has agreed that that authority is legitimate. So when a society legitimates evildoing, and the people in that society believe that the people in authority know what they're doing and require them to obey, they will obey, even if it means acting immorally. This is the second strand of the banality of evil, because the banality of evil does not locate the evildoing in any motivation on the individual, the person. So it's quite frightening to think about that. And to allow ourselves to reflect, we go back to session 1, self-reflection, to go back to this becoming the examined life, the Socratic notion of the examined life's not worth living. When we consider evildoing and producing harm and suffering in the world, we ask ourselves, to what extent are we contributing to that by our assistance to the system that's engaged in it? The third strand of the banality of evil is what I call role immersion. The role immersion means that you have attached your behavior to the particular role you're playing, the job you have, the task at hand. And if you're able to separate out the task from the consequence, from the evil consequence, you can pretend to yourself that that's all you're doing. Like we've seen that Eichmann explained this very clearly in his trial when he said that he never killed anybody. In fact, he tried his very best, that he was very upset by the condition of some of the transports. He was upset that the conditions of the transport that the Jews were in was unnecessarily miserable and painful. He felt that people should be accommodated better on the transports when they were being sent to their death in the concentration camps. He also, because of his role, he also got very upset when the Hungarian Jews, the final tranche of the European Jews, were being transported from Hungary because the Soviets, the Russians, were coming. So they had to rush. They had to build an extra railway carriages and collection points at Auschwitz to handle the levels of transport. But for some reason, Himmler had recalled him, or he had given somebody else the job to do this, and Eichmann was very upset about that because he felt that he was the expert on immigration. That's the role, you see. You think about the role. My job is to take care of the migration, the transportation, and this other person's not doing it right. Their scheduling isn't good. It's not efficient. They're not doing it right. So he's very upset about that, and eventually he got back in charge to make sure that it was all done properly, because his task was to take care of the transportation of the Jews. So he was immersed in his role. Now, this, Hannah Arendt calls this the cog theory. She says each cog, that is, each person, must be expendable without changing the system, an assumption underlying all bureaucracies, all civil service, and all functions, properly speaking. The task one does is discrete, and the individual is saved from guilt or responsibility by reliance on the fact that the task itself is not clearly evil on the one hand and will be done by somebody else in any case on the other. That's not a quotation, that's my own writing there. The quotation from Arendt is simply each cog, that is, each person, must be expendable without changing the system, an assumption underlying all bureaucracies, all civil service, and all functioning, properly speaking, unquote. So the cog theory is you feel like you're just a cog in a machine and you don't take any responsibility for the outcome of what the machine is. You're just doing your task. So in order for the Holocaust to have been effective, the extermination of the European Jews and all the other millions that were involved and that were victims of it, in what is the most iconic form of human evil thus far. I mean, we can learn so much about human evil from our study of the Holocaust because we have all the information. We have so much documentation, and it was so profoundly complex that we can understand more clearly every single level of human evil, that every aspect of human evil is there to be seen. The one we're looking at here is the banality of evil. Of course, that's not all the whole story. The whole story of the Holocaust is one of all the other forms of evil, narcissistic evil, ideological evil, all of that. And we will be examining those further down the line. So, role immersion. This occurs when the person simply denies responsibility for the consequences by actually sticking to what their role is. And a good example of that would be in civil service. At the moment, we'd say in Galway, where I live, there's the county council has responsibility for housing people who cannot or otherwise afford housing. So they go on what's called a housing list. And there are thousands of people on housing lists waiting for social housing to become available. So all of those lists are kept by secretaries and administrators, and the connection between the demands, and there's always more people looking for the houses and become available, and you've got to have a lot of information. You've got to know what their family circumstances, how many people are in the family, what's the level of income coming into that family, where are they living now, are they homeless versus living in a rental accommodation, and all these things have to be factored in, because when a house comes available, then they have to go to the list and say, who will this suit the most? So it's quite complicated. So you're preparing these lists, you're updating them as required and all that. So you've got an administrative task in order to fulfill the responsibility to provide housing for people who can't afford it. Now let's go to the lists of Jews that were assigned for deportation and murder. These were assiduously prepared in every country that the Germans, the Nazis, took over. That was one of their first tasks, is to actually find out who are all the Jews, get them. So this required getting all the information. It required sending out deportation notices, getting them to the stations, doing all of that. So you had secretaries who did all of that. Then you had the postman who delivered the deportation orders. Then you had Eichmann making sure that the numbers were right, so that a certain number of people would show up on one day and then the next day, so that each transport. So there's a huge amount of work. And there's a good sort of description of this. It says and this is in the United States Holocaust Memorial Encyclopedia. Deportations on this scale required the coordination of numerous government agencies, including the Reich Security Main Office, the main office of the Order Police, the Ministry of Transport, and the Foreign Office. The RSHE, which is the Reich Security Main Office, or regional SS police officers, police leaders, coordinated and often directed the deportations. The Order Police were often reinforced by local auxiliaries or collaborators in the occupied territory, who rounded up and then transported the Jews to the killing centres. Working with the Department IVB4 and the RSHA, commanded by SS Lieutenant Adolf Eichmann, the Ministry of Transportation coordinated train schedules. The Foreign Office negotiated with Germans acts as partners over the transfer of their Jewish citizens into German custody. A lot of bureaucracy and administration that required thousands of people. And so much so, and they had so much detail that obviously when some of the Jews disappeared, some of their politically powerful friends would make inquiries. And it was so well put together that oftentimes when some of these politicians, maybe a town mayor or somebody, would actually say what happened to Levy or whatever, and they would be told exactly what time and what they left, where they were, and then they would have, of course, they wouldn't admit that they had been murdered. One of the ones that they would say back then, usually they would say, well, the person died of a heart attack. But one of the most cynical telegrams is one that says their return would present insurmountable problems because, quote, they were already integrated in German economic life in a manner which made their withdrawal completely impractical. They had been slaughtered at this stage, and of course their hair had been used for mattresses and the fat for soap, and so the cynicism involved in describing that they'd been integrated into the German economic structure. There's a level of cynicism and darkness there that's so profound. So, role immersion then is staying in your role, and as Bauman says, he says, and the consequences of this, the actors seldom face the moment of choice and gaze at the consequences of their deeds. More importantly, they hardly ever apprehend what they gaze at as the consequences of their deeds. So they never have to see the actual outcome. So all of these, what Arendt calls desk murderers, were able to say, I didn't kill anybody. I was just making lists. I worked as a secretary. Christopher Browning, another really rich source. His work is such a rich source of understanding of how human evil can develop, and particularly in relation to this, piece, he studied the German engineers who were responsible for constructing the gas vans used to exterminate. This is the beginning of the Holocaust, where they practiced using gas vans because they were looking for new and better ways to murder people. So the engineers created these gas vans, which was initially used to kill mentally handicapped, disabled people, mentally ill people. This is the beginning of the application of the ideology of the pure Aryan race, where the Germans, the Nazis, convinced people through propaganda that these are lives not worth living. So they wanted to exterminate all of the people who are a burden to the state. We'll say that's how they viewed it. But Browning analyzes the conversations and the correspondence between the engineers. And they were very concerned at the technical details, that they were, basically they were having discussions. They'd look at questions, how the best to construct the vans to minimize the amount of gas needed. So that was an economic. So how many can you kill with the minimal amount of gas? The best way to protect the pipework from what they use euphemisms, liquids or whatever, but they're actually describing vomit, urine, feces of the dead and the dying. And to optimally construct them in such a way that the cleaning could be done quickly. Again, efficiency is important in a situation like that, because you want to get a more effective use of the van. So you want to be able to clean it quickly. So sluices and slopes, and all of these conversations are being had about how to make these vans with no reference to what they're actually used for. So these engineers, all highly intelligent, technically brilliant people, having these conversations, and as Browning says, kept fully abreast of the problems arising in the field, they strove for ingenious technical adjustments to make their product more efficient and acceptable to its operators. Their greatest concern seemed to be that they might be deemed inadequate to their assigned tasks. So losing yourself and losing your identity in the assigned role is the third element of the banality unearthed in Arendt's study. Another good example of an experimental support for this then is taken from the field of psychology, where Philip Zimbardo's famous Stanford experiment. He essentially basically got a group of people and divided them into two sets of people, prisoners and prison wardens, in the basement of Stanford University. And essentially they asked the prisoners to give them a special uniform, prisoner uniform, and then the guards. And what they discovered was that once the guards put the uniform on them, they now began to act differently, and some of them acted in ways that were profoundly destructive, malicious, malignant, and cruel. And the prisoners took on the role of being victims, became more passive, and began to suffer. The experiment only lasted 5 days, because it was supposed to go on for 2 weeks, because it was so clear that it was running out of control, that the guards had actually embraced this task of mistreating prisoners, and these people had no initial signs of anything wrong with them. So the minute that they got into the role, they became immersed in it, and they lost their sense of identity. And again, this goes back to the thing about identity, that the role that they're in gives them the justification and the freedom to behave in ways that were cruel. And the passive prisoners, they became victims, and they essentially became more accepting of and helpless, and learned helplessness. The helplessness of their position, they would not fight back. In a more recent example of this, Zygmunt Bauman writes about the Abu Ghraib situation, where the horrible revelations about what was happening in Iraq, and talking about the behavior of the American soldiers in that situation. And he said they're the perpetrators. He writes, "Alas, good, ordinary, likeable American lads and lasses were neither monsters nor perverts. Had they not been assigned to lord over the inmates of Abu Ghraib, we would never have known, or as much surmised, guessed, imagined, or fantasized about the horrifying things they were capable of contriving. It wouldn't have occurred to any of us that the smiling girl at the counter, once on overseas assignment, might excel at devising ever more fanciful as well as wicked and perverse tricks to harass, molest, torture, and humiliate her wards. In their hometown, their neighbours refused to believe that to this very day, that those charming lads and lasses they have known since their childhood are the same folks as the monsters in the snapshots of Abu Ghraib torture chambers. But they are. Okay. That example is a more extreme form of role identification, and as such is frightening to think that that can happen as well. But it's the desk murderer, the one who doesn't see the effect, who doesn't ever kill anybody or beat anybody or torture anybody, but are fundamental to the system working. So the banality of evil, then, to conclude, has three strands. Thoughtlessness, which is the unreflective, behaving, habitual playing out a role. The second is obedience, that role has been given to you by an authority system that you have not questioned and you have accepted as legitimate. And then you save yourself the moral conflict by simply taking responsibility for the task that doesn't have any evil in it. There's no difference between the task of somebody working in this county council office making a list of people who are for a council house, and a person making a list of Jews who are eventually going to be deported. The task is neutral. The task doesn't have anything evil essentially in it. Consequences down the line are, but if I can just stay with this is all I'm doing, I'm not doing anything wrong. For systematic mass evil to occur, you need a lot of people who are willing to do that. Okay, that's the banality of evil. So now we've looked at banal evil doing. So radical evil, which is that internal conflict. Banal evil, we've got individual evil, collective evil. We have the dualist deprivation models. We've covered quite a bit now. And we are now going to move on to what ties a lot of this together. And what ties a lot of this together for people to operate in an evil manner is ideology. We're going to look at the role of ideological evil. And ideological evil does one of two things. One, ideology can construct the system whereby banality functions best. So you don't need a lot of ideologues. You don't need it. They can be a minority, because they can harness the energy, the time, the productive resources of the banal. The second piece about ideology is ideology does something very interesting in terms of our Kantian understanding of evil, which is it can provide a new moral system which is actually evil. But the person, the ideologue, doesn't understand it that way, doesn't see it that way, or doesn't want to see it that way. So it can actually corrupt conscience. You replace humane morality with an ideology that has the pretense of morality. That's why, for example, the pure Aryan race, that's a very interesting ideology. You know, most people, purity is a virtue, and amazing. Imagine if it's going to improve the world. Marxism, we're going to have, to each according to their needs, from each according to their ability. Beautiful, beautiful sentiments. Ideological sentiments that are dressed up in such a way that when you actually murder people or torture people or deprive people or do all of that stuff, you're doing it, but you're doing it for their own good. Ideology. That's our next conversation, and I'm looking forward to that. That'll be session 6. So, thank you. See you then.